And with our last point today, we believe that the unemployment during the COVID-19 pandemic that we're currently experiencing is very um, unusual, and that how the housing costs are increasing compared to incomes. There's about 4 million residents within the Inland Empire region, and the average salary that residents make throughout the year is 37,000 per year. And as Nava stated, 58,000 is a self-sufficient standard of living in the Inland Empire. And so it's very unrealistic how income isn't as high as the self-sufficient living standard. And with groceries versus rent, a lot of residents are choosing whether they're able to buy the groceries for their families or pay their rent for the month. Within the crisis, it's been happening for beginning of this year. And so it concludes for families to struggle with these uncertain times, and nobody is sure when the workers will be able to go back, being that we're in phase 2 within the state. And also for mental health, for college students, food and housing insecurities are strongly related to depression, anxiety, eating disorders, and suicidal thoughts, with many other mental health issues. And so all of these are increasing because of the situation as of now. And so with students and also residents in the empire that are not students, it is very tragic to see that many people are struggling through these times. And even without the pandemic going on, people do struggle with paying their rent within the region. And so we know that these issues are more common, but have significantly increased because of the current situation of COVID-19.
Thank you, Imad and Nava. Now we will move on to the cross-examination. Sam and Andrea, you may begin posing questions to the affirmative team.
Okay, I'll begin and then Andrea will go. My first question on the slide, this recent slide about COVID-19 and unemployment, you mentioned that housing prices were rising compared to incomes. According to a recent study by Zillow, US citizens should expect a 2 to 3% decline in housing prices. What studies have you cited that show housing prices rising during COVID-19?
Right, so in response to your question, there have been several studies that have been conducted within the Inland Empire. For example, Mark Takano did a study a few years ago called Rent on the Rise in Riverside. And so in his report, he clearly states his research that has been done that proves that the incomes have been on a steady decline in the Inland Empire and the housing costs have been increasing. And he analyzes these implications on the residents in the region.
So, but my question, you had it specifically on the slide about COVID-19, where you said it was rising during COVID-19. And I'm wondering, do you see housing prices rising during COVID-19? What studies have you cited that show that they're rising during this pandemic?
Yes, so it was stated that the unemployment was increasing during COVID-19, not the housing prices. And so when people aren't going to work, it's been about 3 months that many people aren't working, and we're not sure when people are able to go back to work. It's that they're not really receiving the income that they usually receive, and so they're struggling to pay their rent. And some housing were able to kind of give them a month or two to pay their rent. That's usually not on time, but during these situations, we believe that lowering the housing costs would relieve the stress and also give people more opportunity to focus on more things other than their rent.
So just to be clear, you haven't seen any studies showing housing prices rising in this year, 2020?
Well, COVID is obviously a new circumstance that we're also adjusting to, but it is, although there are no studies out that are able to show ample evidence that housing prices are increasing. It is known that that people are filing for unemployment and they're out of jobs, and so that is greatly affecting their ability to find housing and to provide basic needs for their families during this time specifically.
Okay, and my second question is, why do you believe that this issue of student homelessness should be left up to cities instead of the college campuses where these students attend?
So basically, whenever the universities set the prices for their housing, they usually compare it to the surrounding areas and what the cities base off their housing. And so if the city were able to lower their housing costs, then the university would also follow. many of the students, about 70%, live off campus. And so this would benefit most of the university students because they don't typically live on campus, since it usually is an increased price. Like I said, it is a 5,000 difference per year. And so if the city were to lower their cost lower than 10,000 a year, then also the university would follow, because they would have to compete with their surrounding areas and be able to adapt to students' needs. And also, just a given point, most of these universities that were stated, they are public institutions, and so they are a part of the state and receive the support from the state.
Thank you. Andrea, if you'd like to ask your questions now.
So you mentioned that there are fewer than half of the jobs in the IE are less than the paying living wage. So would you agree that if we lower the cost of living, employers would have less of a chance to raise the current wage for employees at the moment?
So just to clarify your question, you're asking, given that 50%, or given that about 45% of Inland Empire residents are unable to provide basic needs for their families, that would be a disincentive for employers to increase wages? Is that what the question was?
Okay, so if we were to lower the price of living, that would there would be less revenue for employers to make. So then they would have to cut back on employers. If there's a drop in cost of living, there would be a drop in employment. So don't you think that would affect employees?
So if I'm understanding correctly, I don't know why that would be the case. If lower housing costs would cause there to be less employment opportunities.
Well, this would just be applied to costs like of living. This would be to the housing prices. This is overall living, like basic necessities. So it would be things like groceries. So we're paying drop groceries, then there's be less revenue making for markets, which would have to decrease their amount of employees and would cut back on wages and employers.
Right. Well, housing costs in a region should be based on need of residents, and currently, based on the statistics that were previously stated, it is clear that the residents in the Inland Empire are not able to meet the self-sufficiency standard that is set by the region. Therefore, the price of housing, the cost of housing, is not meeting those residents' needs. So it would not be harming the economy. It would actually be allowing people to provide these basic needs for their families and have a roof over their heads and not have to worry about these basic necessities, and therefore be able to lead more productive and more productive lives and prioritize what is important, instead of having to worry about whether or not their kids are going to have a roof over their head next month. As Imad stated, it's rent versus groceries right now.
This argument is about
the time that we have for the cross-examination. Sorry to cut things short, but the negative team will present now their case, and Sam and Andrea, you may begin.
Okay, so we analyzed lowering the cost of living not just on, or why we shouldn't lower the cost of living not just on housing. We took an overall approach, looking at other aspects besides just housing costs. So I'll have Andrea start off our presentation.
Okay, so I want to analyze lowering the cost of living through the lenses of principles of microeconomics. So lowering the cost of living would only be attainable short-term or in extreme cases, such as now with COVID-19, we had to enforce a 60-day suspension on rent evictions, because if this is attained long-term, it would affect our economy as a whole, with shortages, rationing, queues, and even chances of exploitation. So if we're lowering the cost of living, we're alluding to price controls, and there are two types of price controls: price ceiling and price floor. Pricing is pretty much setting a legal set maximum price that can be set. Here we can see on the graphs, let's say $3 is the equilibrium for a certain product or service. If we were to lower it to $2, we would have a quantity effect, which creates a shortage and a deadweight loss to society because supply and demand is not at equilibrium. So I want to show how price controls has affected us in the past, and has history repeats itself. It can affect us now. And gasoline, I know right now it's not essential, but outside of the COVID-19 circumstances, this is dependent for commuters. During 1970s, President Nixon set a price ceiling on crude oil and gasoline prices. And unfortunately, this led to shortages in gasoline and forced gas dealers to ration gas, and it created long lines of cars, and sometimes it ended up with gas stations having to shut down and led opportunities of exploitation where gas dealers were implementing surcharges to make up for that lost revenue. So how would it affect IE's housing? So as of now, it was stated that the cost of Riverside's cost of living is already below California's average rent. So if we were to reduce it even lower, it would cause a shortage among housing availability. Yes, it would be beneficial to those who currently have homes because their rent would be decreased. However, it would be detrimental to those who are looking for homes. And with prices dropping, less investors are going to be interested in purchasing homes because they're not going to be making any profits out of it, or the profits would be reduced and go at a complete loss, thus leaving less incentive for them to maintain their existing properties. And in a study done on economists, there was all economists but 6% agree that a ceiling on rents would reduce the quality and quantity of housing available. So essentially, this can lead to decrease in property tax revenue, which would lead the IE to greater levels of impoverishment. And with greater levels of impoverishment and reduced property taxes, we'll have cutbacks on community fundings. So we would see this would be reflected on our quality of public services, spaces, and products. So we would have lower maintenance, let's say in parks, transportation, and our resources for schools. And as mentioned prior, yes, we are focused on our students are our future, right? So if these students aren't going to have the adequate tools to reap the benefits of their education, it's going to be detrimental for our future. And it would also affect our local businesses. With less local businesses around our community, residents are going to be forced to go out of the area to look for certain products, services, or even jobs. As you all might have seen, a lot of the traffic goes from the IE to LA. And this is in search mostly for jobs or even entertainment. So this is how it would decrease employment, how lowering the cost of living would decrease employment. So it would decrease the job market because less employment will be available. With the cost of basic necessities being lowered, employers will not be generating sufficient money to pay employers at the current wage, and even might have to cut back on employees and wages.
Sorry about that. Another issue that comes with a lower cost of living is overcrowding. And this is something that the Inland Empire is already facing. Essentially, the Inland Empire has faced, the counties within the Inland Empire have faced a constant expansion in the number of residents within this region. And low housing costs do incentivize people to move to the Inland Empire, causing overcrowding. There's been a lot of people moving to the Inland Empire, specifically Riverside, within the past few years. From 2010 to 2018, during these 8 years, Riverside County experienced an average increase of over 31,000 residents each year. In 2019 alone, that number actually jumped up to 33,500. So we did see an increase in the amount of people moving to Riverside last year. This was the 5th biggest increase out of any county within the United States. So like I said, California is a spot where a lot of people move to. We have, as Andrea mentioned earlier, we are below the California average housing price, which does encourage people to move specifically to the Inland Empire. Some effects of overcrowding are the freeways being packed, right? And less people being able to get necessary resources. We have more public service resources such as medical, police, firemen being spread too thin across a large population. So that's a huge issue that's associated with a lower cost of living. Additionally, you have to look at the actual cost, the cost of affordable housing. So the cost of building a 100-unit affordable housing project in California increased from $265,000 per unit in 2000 to almost $425,000 in 2016. That's from a study by UC Berkeley. So we can see the price of housing has nearly doubled in that short span of time. Recent policies as well are causing the prices to get ratcheted up as well. If you look at a recent policy mandate that said in 2020, all houses built after 2020 have to be installed with solar panels, that added about $10,000 to the median price of a house. So if we want to, we're facing a huge climate crisis right now. If we want to create houses that are environmentally friendly and that don't damage the environment, and continue to take care of the environment, that is going to raise the cost of living. So really this is part of this argument in raising the cost of living is a better environment or a lower cost of living and less funding for environmental protection measures. We also have to take into account the economy of the Inland Empire. Riverside specifically is considered a sinkhole city. And basically that sinkhole city is a state that has taxpayer burdens and needs additional funds from the state to pay all its bills. As of March 2020, Riverside's pension debt was $3.5 billion. This is only expected to grow larger with the economy's disruptions by COVID-19. We do expect to see a huge recessionary period and Riverside sinking more and more into debt. Riverside cannot manage to lose money like this by investing in services that provide a low cost of living for residents while also trying to lower its debt. It's not possible to lower the cost of living and also lower the debt in Riverside. So if Riverside's in debt, once again, that equates to less hiring of government officials within Riverside County, within less hiring of public service officials, and we're missing out on a lot of necessary functions. We're having to cut back on different things within Riverside's government, and that can prove catastrophic in the long run.
So I want to take a different approach on lowering the cost of living and maybe acknowledge that we're a region of immigrants, the I is in region of immigrants. And this was presented by the Center for Social Innovation report, which reports that there are nearly 1 million immigrants who reside in Riverside and San Bernardino County, making 1 in 5 residents immigrants. So I want us to think that maybe these residents are not being affected by the cost of living more so than their immigration status. So they are being ineligible to things such as rights, benefits, job attainment, wages, and being exploited into maybe jobs, and their wages are not giving in a living wage because of their status. So maybe we have to take a different approach into social services that work with immigrants who are not benefiting from rights and benefits.
Thank you. So that's all the time we have. So thank you, Sam and Andrea. So let's move on to the cross-examination. Imad and Nava, you may begin posing questions to the negative team.
Okay, so our first question for the opposing team would be, if you believe that lowering the cost of housing would be efficient enough to help the Inland Empire, then if you do not believe, that lowering the cost of housing would be efficient enough to help the Inland Empire, then what solutions or alternatives do you propose to combat the issue?
So as we mentioned, we see it as important in investing in social programs that will help raise the standard of living within the Inland Empire. Obviously, if you lower the cost of living, it's going to decrease the amount of money going into the local economy. So in order to still protect these individuals, investing in social programs will be beneficial, and that's where we see the correct solution to be.
So being that our topic is about lowering the cost of housing and not about social services, and being that quote unquote we're a region of immigrants, how are there disadvantages that are there many disadvantages that come with that? How will the housing costs stay the same, benefit that community specifically?
Well, I think one thing you just mentioned, you said this debate was specifically on the cost of housing, but I think it's actually on the cost of living in general. So I think it's wrong just to focus on housing as a cost of living. You know, this is on raising or lowering the cost of living, and that does encompass a large, it encompasses more than just housing for sure. So I would like to point that out, but could you repeat the second part of your question?
Yes, so how would cost of living staying the same benefit the community that was brought up?
I don't think it would benefit them, of course, if it's at the same price, but for that certain population, I believe we have to invest programs with them and work with them, give us housing assistance to that certain population rather than bring down the whole city's economy as a whole. If some can pay it at it is right now, and those who can, then we should work with those who are not able to make ends meet.
Exactly. And when you do lower the cost of living, if you do lower those housing payments, you're going to see a decrease in the amount of property taxes being paid, which go to fund social service programs and the economy as well. And that's just one example, but you will see a decrease in the amount of money that's being funneled into the Inland Empire's economy. And that's just going to, it's not going to allow the Inland Empire to expand.
Right. Just to intervene, what would your response be to the fact that if people are spending less on their cost of living or cost of housing for that matter, they would have more money to spend on the economy and to spend in local businesses and to stimulate that growth?
But that's like trickle down economics. And we've seen on multiple occasions that that doesn't work. When the consumers do have more money or the companies have more money, they're not going to spend it. It's not going to stimulate that economy. It's going to be saved for the most part. You know, obviously that's not going to happen on every occasion, but for a majority of these cases, what's going to happen is this money's going to be saved. And it really ultimately will not have a huge effect on the economy itself.
Okay. If we have time, we have one more question. Since you stated overcrowding is an issue, are you saying that it is good for the housing costs to be higher because they will serve as a disincentive for moving to the Inland Empire? What is your response to the fact that the Inland Empire has a poverty rate of 20% and lowering the housing costs would essentially work towards mitigating that?
I'm not saying it's good that the housing prices will continue to rise, but it's purely, as we mentioned at the beginning of our argument, it's the basis of economics. It's going to rise as the demand goes up. The supply is going to go down, right? So there is a huge demand to move into the Inland Empire. Obviously, there's not much more we can do. We can't limit the economy. The economy is going to continue to rise based on demand. And so there is more demand, as we've seen, there is an increased demand in Riverside. There is going to be, the housing prices will just naturally rise. And if you do limit that, it's going to cause a bevy of issues, like we've mentioned, a lack of funding for different social programs, overcrowding, so less people will have access to different goods and materials and public service utilities. Also, yeah, looking at public utilities as well, you're going to see more people sharing these utilities, and you can have more blackouts, right? Less share of water and whatnot. It has vast environmental impacts, social impacts. It's just, if the Inland Empire is overcrowded, that is going to be very negative for Riverside, San Bernardino, and it's ultimately going to lower the standard of living within the Inland Empire.
And so being that Central California, a city within the Central California, Bakersfield, was lower than Riverside as well. Do you think that there's overcrowding in that city specifically, being that it's lower?
So can you be in San Bernardino specifically? What? Could you repeat that?
I believe the time is up.
Okay.
Yeah, unfortunately, the time is up. So sorry to cut you all off again, but thank you all for your remarks. So now we will begin with the affirmative team rebuttal. Imad and Nava, you may begin.
Okay, so going back to this overcrowding point. So it was just stated in the opposing case that if the housing costs are lowered, then that will incentivize people to move to the Inland Empire, and due to the rapid population growth in the region, will cause overcrowding. But it was also claimed that the Inland Empire already experiences this. So for that reason, this entire point can be very misleading. According to the California Economic Summit, overcrowding is defined as having more than one family live under the same roof. The Inland Empire already has a level of overcrowding that is actually double the national average. For this reason, and the reason for this is the rising rental rates and falling income among low income and very low income earners, as well as the lack of funding for new affordable housing units. The Inland Empire's poverty rate is about 17%. But again, according to this study, if that percentage is adjusted to include housing costs, that reaches 21% poverty rate, meaning that more than 1 in 5 families in the Inland Empire experience poverty. So based on these points, the Inland Empire is already experiencing overcrowding, and by not lowering the housing costs, that will actually work against lowering the poverty rate.
So I'd like to reiterate about the price control on gasoline in the 1970s that was stated by the opposing team. And so it was stated that price control within gasoline impacted the gasoline issue with shutting down gas stations and also making it be created for long lines of cars waiting for hours to pump gas. And so now that this is 2 different regions, we're talking about the United States with gasoline, and now we're talking about the Inland Empire with living opportunities. And so being that this is from the 1970s and now that we're in 2020, about 112 million drivers had license during the 1970s, and now that we're doubled up with 2020, it's a big difference. And with cars versus houses, now that we're in the COVID-19 situation, we see that gas prices have significantly lowered. I'm sure all of us have enjoyed that and have seen that as of today. And so being that there are currently no long lines, that it's not an issue. It just shows that this example wasn't really as relevant with the house of living, and times have changed, and we're talking about 2 different areas of a region versus a whole country. And it's best that we focus more on living houses or living situation.
Yeah, and so our third point in our rebuttal has to do with the opposing case's point about investors. So again, in reference to the report by Mark Takano, Rent on the Rise in Riverside, rising rent prices has led to an increase of investors in the Inland Empire. So instead of the housing market being driven by local homeowners, investors are actually monopolizing the housing market. So because these higher prices are attracting more investors because they're getting, it's helping their wallets, more challenges are actually being introduced into the rental market. For example, lack of competition for rental prices, less housing availability, lowered maintenance of these homes, and destabilization of the housing market with renters who previously were not able to keep up with their dues, and now even more. If the housing prices are lowered in the Inland Empire, there will be less investors that are interested in investing, therefore mitigating these concerns.
So next we have the negative team rebuttal. So Sam and Andrea, you may begin.
Great. And before I start, I think I want to point out when we were mentioning the price controls on gasoline earlier, that was merely an example of how the economy works and how price controls and price ceilings work. We weren't really trying to make that an argument. Well, yeah, obviously it's an example showing why price controls and price ceilings don't work, but we didn't mean to relate that to the cost of living by any means with the price of gasoline. We aren't equating that in any way to the price of living, just setting that as an example. But to begin, I think, as you recently said, I think on your last slide, you said more investors in the Inland Empire would lead to monopolization. And I think that's false. Santa Cruz, I live in Santa Cruz, right? Right now I'm at home in Santa Cruz. We have one of the highest rent prices in California, but it's mostly composed of small businesses with little monopolization. We don't see that monopolization that you are talking about or that you stated in your slides. And I think, you know, if we do have a lower cost of living, that is going to cause more warehouses to be built like Amazon or Walmart because, you know, that they have that low cost of living. Low cost of living is going to incentivize these big corporations to continue building in the Inland Empire. And that's something that a lot of people have complained about because one, it hurts the environment when you have these big trucks going through Riverside. You're also going to have lower paying jobs. So I think that's important to point out when you do talk about a lower cost of living. Additionally, yeah, it is basically unfair to let the cities manage student homelessness. The onus should be on these universities. You know, they net millions of dollars each year from student tuition. It's not like these universities don't have money saved up. And this money does finance a vast number of different things. You have, right, faculty payments, so it's staff, building costs, electricity, utilities, all that, but there's still money left over. Even after all of this, the universities still have millions, if not billions of dollars saved up, and they should allocate finances to create funds, ensuring that students aren't homeless. And I think that's an important thing to talk about. Your argument is saying the city should take care of the student homelessness issue, but it is the colleges that are bringing these students to these regions. And if they can't sustain their own college students, it's unfair. And then additionally, as you mentioned earlier, and I had asked you about, there's no way to see if housing prices are actually increasing during COVID-19. As we cited, housing prices are expected to drop 2 to 3%. In fact, most tenants, there's been orders across the country stating that tenants cannot charge their renters during this time because we are in this huge economic crisis. Lowering the cost of living is you know, it might lower naturally, and that's fine, right? But the government shouldn't spend money and resources just to make the cost of living go down. If anything, as we've mentioned on multiple occasions, the Inland Empire's government should put money towards government resources such as social programs and social welfare programs. And also it should work towards reducing its debt. With such a huge pension debt, that means that many teachers within the Inland Empire might not be able to see these funds, right, as after they retire. And that could be very disastrous, especially in this COVID-19 era. And then I think while income may be for some within the Inland Empire, we should not focus on sustaining those working below the average income, right? It's always going to continue to rise. This is basic supply and demand. As we've mentioned on multiple occasions, there is a greater demand to California, right, in housing, and with overcrowding and more residents living within the Inland Empire, there is a greater demand on public resources and utilities and stuff like that. So even if the government attempted to lower the cost of living, it would cause adverse effects that would ripple throughout the Inland Empire, such as a resource disparity in comparison to other areas of California. Raised income may benefit those making the least amount of money in the Inland Empire, but it will ultimately hurt the majority of residents living in that area. And that is our rebuttal.
Thank you. Now we will begin the affirmative conclusion. Imada Nava, you may begin.
Okay, so in conclusion, Imad and I would like to reiterate our stance on the issue of the high cost of housing in the Inland Empire. It is doing more harm than good for its residents. First, with increasing rent prices, many workers within the region do not make enough to have a living wage, as they have been decreasing for the past decade. Nearly 1/3 of residents in the Inland Empire contribute more than 50% of their incomes to housing, which is unacceptable.
Also, second, the high costs of housing are very unnecessary for college students who are working hard to pursue their degrees and making many sacrifices, whether it be giving up eating for a day, not being able to buy textbooks, not attending a four-year university because of housing insecurities, or even pursuing a higher education for grad school because of many burdens that students face, and housing being the most expensive aspect within their experiences.
Yeah, thirdly, the state of California does not provide enough housing assistance programs to combat the increasing levels of poverty and lack of basic needs in the Inland Empire, which is obvious in the fact, again, that they are not able to provide the basic needs for their families with their wages currently. The residents do not meet the self-sufficiency standards set by the region and are all contributing to the lack of upward mobility in the Inland Empire.
And so with the state of California not providing enough housing assistance, the state of California not providing enough housing assistance programs to combat the increasing levels of poverty, we see that the COVID-19 situation has led to a national pandemic, which many of us are unemployed as of now, whether it's students or professional workers. People haven't been working for 3 months, and we believe this is the perfect time to lower the cost of rent. We're not asking for a significant lower of cost of rent, but a sufficient enough for the region and its residents. And also, whether it's COVID-19 hitting at the moment or not, many Inland Empire regions do experience difficulty. And I wasn't able to get my question answered, but the region of Bakersfield, which I'm actually from, and also Sacramento, those housing costs are significantly lower than the Inland Empire. So I'm not sure why the Inland Empire region isn't able to match their prices. Being that cities in the coast of California, it makes sense to have expensive housing costs because it's on the coast. And so with these three regions that I just stated, they're significantly similar. And I'd like to go to the next slide, please, Nava. And show that this was the graph that I was able to see of how the poor earn a certain amount and have to pay a certain amount, being sometimes even more that they have to pay with their housing. And then the rich being able to earn a certain amount, save certain amounts that they make, invest certain amounts, and then not having to spend enough. And so being that we were stating that this is a region of immigrants, it's very difficult for individuals and first generation college students to successfully be able to grow and improve in their lives when they have to pay significant amounts of their housing costs. And so for that reason, for all these reasons stated, we strongly believe that the cost of living should be lowered in the Inland Empire, and as a great marginal benefit and will improve the lives of the residents within the region. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Imad and Ava. Lastly, we have the negative conclusion. Andrea and Sam, you may begin.
Okay, so overall, a higher cost of living is necessary to ensure that the Inland Empire is able to reduce its debt, provide ample resources for its residents, and to prevent overcrowding. Reducing the cost of living is a short-term goal, which can be beneficial for extreme circumstances, such as COVID-19. However, lowering costs cannot be attainable for a long period of time. If the government continues to spend money and enforce regulations lowering the cost of living, that's going to be basically wasting money. The government's going to have to be sustaining these programs, most likely by paying the tenants part of the rent prices. It's going to be the government's basically going to be throwing money into this pit that's going to continue growing, because the economy, as we've mentioned on multiple times, it acts naturally, right? It's supply and demand. When there's more demand, there's less supply, and vice versa. And the economy is just naturally going to grow. There's inflation, right? There's a lot of different things that cause the economy to grow. And we have seen over the past, just like since 2000, the economy has grown tremendously, right? And we'll look at after 2008, since the housing crisis, the economy has grown, and it's going to continue to grow. So as long as we limit the cost of living and keep it low, it's unsustainable. It's not going to provide resources for those who need it. There's going to be less funding for social programs, because your argument basically centers around a lower cost of living, but you don't analyze the other different resources that these people who need to take advantage of, such as like SNAP benefits, right? And like EBT and stuff like that, which these counties will help fund. So we need to take into account these social programs that will receive less funding, and certain things like education. You know, a huge portion, 17% of property tax goes towards local education, local schools. So if you lower the cost of living, you're going to have less money going towards these schools, and the government's going to have to sustain that. Or what will most likely happen is these schools are just going to suffer from a lack of resources, and people are going to receive a worse education. And couple that with overcrowding in the region, where you have more kids in each classroom and less funding for the schools, that's a recipe for disaster. Thus, we recommend investing in social welfare programs rather than lowering the cost of living. Thank you.
So thank you all very much. Now we will move on to the audience Q&A portion. So if any of our audience members would like to pose any questions to our debaters, please raise your hand virtually, and then we will call on you and unmute you. Drew, you may pose your question.
Yeah, I thought this was a good debate. As a poli-sci major, I think this is a relevant topic. Before I answer my question, I just want to state that I myself have experienced this type of rise of living crisis because I've lived in my own car myself, so I know what that's like. So I kind of agree with both sides, the pros and the con side. I think that what is your name on the team 2? For team 2, the debater, what is your name?
I'm Andrea, and that's Sam.
So Sam, is that Sam?
Yeah.
Yeah, my question is for you, Sam. Yeah, I agree with you. I think that welfare programs are good, but so I guess my question is, how do we, is welfareism really the solution to a sustainable reduction of living standards? I personally don't see how that can happen, because right now with how is welfareism, how does that produce lower or higher standards of living? Because right now the cost of living is purely dictated based upon the demand, which you're saying over and over again, which is true. But even if that's the case, I don't see how that just creates more dependency. No.
So essentially, we're using welfare to help sustain those in need, right? An argument for a lower cost of living is these people are suffering, right, from a lower cost of, or from the high cost of housing. But when we do provide social programs and welfare programs for those who, may have trouble paying their rent, their monthly rent, it will help them to have more access to food. So maybe that they have to worry less about getting these resources, and they can allocate more money to paying that rent and actually successfully do that. I'm not saying by any means that the state should cover all expenses or the county should cover all expenses for those in need, but necessary things like food, which is an issue, allocating more money for resources like that, and then these people will be able to pay their rent. I think an issue with having a lower cost of living is that, like I said, you're going to see a decrease in the amount of funding actually going to the government. And that's going to effectively reduce the GDP of the Inland Empire. And I think, as long as as I've said, right, supply and demand, there's a demand to move into California. There's a demand to move into the Inland Empire because it's close to play.
I got to get ready to run here in a little minute, and I don't want to take up too much of David's time. I just want one more clarification. So what I'm wondering though, right, is so for California, right? So But the problem though is, right, is that because we have welfareism, I'm not against welfareism. I'm just saying that wouldn't it be, but the whole problem, right, which is what I agree with the con side, they're saying that because our wages aren't increasing, then we'll keep having this problem, right? The whole reason why, like right now, my rent is like $700, and you're right, you said that 50% of my pay is taken towards my rent, which is accurate. But would it my final clarification I want to know is it more efficient rather than doing welfareism, but to find a way to somehow increase the wages, or is that not possible?
Well, I don't think it would. I mean, right, this isn't welfareism. This is just providing social programs to help those in need. But I think, you know, as the cost of living does continue to rise, we're going to see a rise in wages. That's just how the economy works. As the minimum wage, right, will go up, the amount of money that people are making per hour is going to rise, so they can still live in these regions. It's not going, wages aren't going to remain stagnant. They're going to rise as the economy does better.
Alrighty. All right, good debate, guys. I gotta run right now.
Hi, everyone. So I also had a question for Team 2 in regards to the overcrowding point. I just wanted to get a little bit more clarification on like the repercussions of overcrowding. For example, I think one of the points that you mentioned is if there's overcrowding, there's more traffic. But I think there's a little bit more context to that, right? Like, is the traffic due to more people living here? Is the traffic due to there not being enough opportunities within the region? Like, are all these effects of overcrowding attributed specifically to more people coming, or is it because, you know, there's just not enough opportunities, and that attributes to, you know, the cost of living? And you know, LA has a lot more people, but even though their conditions aren't perfect by any means either, they're able to have more opportunities, and they're in fact forcing a lot of people to move over to the Inland Empire and commute farther and farther to actually be able to work. Because as we've seen even from the report you cited, the warehouse jobs are depressing. The report that you cited stated also that wages are depressed partly because of the rise in warehouse jobs.
So yeah, I think, you know, overcrowding is both, you know, when you do, or traffic, when you do have more people moving into the region and you do have more cars on the road, obviously that's going to be overcrowding. But I also see your point about people moving to the Inland Empire. And I would like to point out, you know, with a lower cost of living, as I mentioned earlier, it's cheaper to buy land and to build properties in this region. And that is why we are facing a lot of these warehouses being built in the Inland Empire. They're able to keep workers at pay workers at low wages and low costs, as well as develop these huge warehouses on cheap land. And that is a driver, I think, and a reason why a lower cost of living, we don't see, you know, the economy like LA, where they do have a higher cost of living and a better job market there.
Yeah, wait, I just wanted to mention also, like, if we were to raise the cost, well, if we had more local businesses too, we would be able to offer more opportunities for residents here in the IE. Yet if we were to lower the wages, then less businesses would be willing to invest in our area. So it would rob us of more opportunities.
I actually had a question. For many cities within the Inland Empire, businesses are often given city council approval to grow and expand their warehouses and industry within the respective regions. In the city of Eastvale, for example, a fairly new and small city in the county, the city's motto is that it is a business-friendly city. As a result of this mindset, the city has placed an interest in building up businesses, both local and I'm blanking on the word, but like bigger business and the development of new tightly packed houses that serve these underserved populations that we've been talking about. The mayor claims that these investments are creating increased social programs for the community. So I'm curious to know what your respective opinions are regarding this matter, as far as something that impacts both sides of the conversation.
So to clarify, you're talking about how we feel about the business development and increase in housing. Could you repeat your question one more time?
Yeah, so in a city like Eastvale, one of its main taglines is that it is a business-friendly city. So with these local businesses that you've mentioned, the city strives to, improve that, but it's also building a lot of like new houses to serve these served communities. So I'm curious to know what your opinions are regarding this matter.
So you're saying that these like businesses are giving back to the community, like programs that are giving back. Is that what? Yeah. I think that would be a good plan to go on it too. I know there's also Target who gives, they do food banks and give back to, I think it's 5% back to the community. Anything that they get goes back as well. So I guess it's another way to redistribute to the community.
If I may add something, since it seemed to be a general question. So when we're talking about building businesses, if you look at the Bay Area, if you look at the Silicon Valley, all these successful big cities have these warehouses and they have these big businesses, both local and corporate. And so I definitely think that Eastvale is taking a step in the right direction by branding itself as a company-driven community, trying to build these homes that are closer together, providing more housing for these communities. If we look at, I'm sorry, let me get my train of thought back together. If we're building all of these businesses and we're building all these new companies, people need to be hired to build them. People need to be hired to work within them. People need to be hired to work the administration. That's going to open up more jobs for our economy. That's going to open up more opportunities for people to, get these jobs and be able to provide these basic needs for their families. Again, looking at the Inland Empire, there are so many people that are on welfare. According to this article by Independent Voter, the co-coordinator of the Green Party of Los Angeles County has stated that Riverside and San Bernardino counties in California have a higher rate of people on food stamps and welfare than anywhere else in Southern California. So if we're talking about increasing welfare, it's not doing anything for the people. They're underfunded. People are not able to just ride on these food stamps and provide for their families. So by building these companies, by building these homes that are closer together, you're providing homes, you're providing employment opportunities, and you're providing an opportunity for upward mobility for residents who otherwise would not have those opportunities in the Inland Empire.
But I think it's important to point out that, the solution to getting more people to be able to actually thrive and not be on these programs within the Inland Empire is for the economy to grow, right? We aren't going to see an increase in wages. We aren't going to see an increase in the amount of savings that all these residents have when we do lower this cost of living. It's not going to be conducive to the economy in Riverside, which is billions of dollars in debt. It's not going to, the Riverside government, the Inland Empire government is going to need to dig itself out of this hole, and it's not going to be able to do so unless we raise this cost of living, because there's going to be less money flowing into the government. And so that's something that's very important to understand, is that when the government is in debt, it's going to cause so many problems for these citizens that it's not going to just be on the basis, it's going to have way more broad effects than funneling, giving these citizens who are struggling with rent payments, giving them, welfare, social programs, investing in social programs to help aid them, you know, if we do that and continue to reduce the debt of Riverside as the economy increases and grows, that's going to have a lot more benefits than it is if we lower the cost of living. I think, you know, obviously there's pros and cons to each side. Neither side is perfect. There's in the lot overall, it's still going to amount to some people getting left out. And that's just something that you have to understand. Like, you have to look at no plan is going to be perfect. No plan is going to benefit everybody. But the plan that does have the more benefits and does seem to be more beneficial for everyone is raising the cost of living.
Okay, so people can't afford housing as it is now, but you want to raise the cost of living so that they are further suffering and further unable to pay for food and for groceries and for children's school supplies, because
I think the economy
for more money to the government for more welfare programs for counties that are already having welfare programs more than any other county in Southern California, and also have 20% poverty rates. I just don't see how that adds up personally.
I think Riverside shouldn't limit the growth of the economy. And, you know, obviously with COVID-19, that is going to cause a decrease in the cost of living. It's just, that's going to happen nationally, right? And I'm not opposed to that. I think that the economy should be able to function naturally without the government forcing it to remain at a low cost, and thus having the economy and the Inland Empire be hurt by that. I think it, you know, it will, if the economy is naturally able to lower, which it will naturally lower because of COVID-19 and this recession that we're facing, I think that's going to happen naturally. I'm not opposed to that.
Yes, one of your
what I'm opposed to is the government and Riverside and the Inland Empire actually funneling money to lower that cost of living itself, when it should be getting itself out of debt and funding social programs instead.
Yeah, so one of your questions to us during the cross-examination was, what study were we referring to when we said that during COVID-19 that the house prices were going to increase? I can ask that same question to you based on that claim that you just made, right? You are predicting that something is going to happen due to the current circumstances, but there are no studies that are backing that up.
I cited that. I had a study by Zillow, and I can actually share it on my screen if you all would like, but there is a 3% increase in the cost of housing.
Unfortunately, we're going to move on to the next question. I'm sorry, you all. We have a couple more questions that I'm going to answer, but thank you all for your input to Paula's question. So Maddie, you may begin to ask your question.
Thanks. Well, I just want to say congratulations and good jobs to both teams. You've both made great points. I just wanted to give both teams a chance to clarify a little bit. So the topic of this debate is the cost of living in the Inland Empire, and Team 1 went with cost of housing and Team 2 went with standard of living. So I would love to give both teams an opportunity, starting with Team 1, of why your measurement is a better measurement of than the other team.
Yes, so basically the issue within the Inland Empire with incomes decreasing and rent increasing, it just shows that the region has been struggling for many years now compared to the surrounding areas of Orange County, but also the LA County. And so basically it all depends on the housing crisis and how much rent is. People aren't able to afford where they are living because they're not making enough with their incomes. And yes, incomes should be increased. However, it is not sufficiently enough for the cost of housing. And as I brought up, there are many different examples of the Central California and also North California. There's many cities and regions that are very similar to the Inland Empire, being in the middle of California, and also just having opportunities for minorities, and also expanding. As we see, the Inland Empire has many locations that are currently expanding with businesses, with different housing. And so we believe that a very great solution would be to lower the cost of housing, so people, as the opposing team stated, the region of immigrants, people can thrive within their lives, give opportunity to the children to attend for universities, and end up more looking towards the long term for our economy, and be able to also start their own businesses and successfully support their families instead of not being able to sufficiently live their own lives, start their own businesses, increase within their jobs of their titles, and then also having to just remain homeless within the region.
Yeah, if I may add, so as I previously mentioned, like before in our initial case, if families are contributing 30% of their incomes to housing costs, they are considered burdened by housing costs. If they contribute 50%, they are considered severely burdened. Residents in the Inland Empire, a majority of them face both issues. And so housing prices between 30 to 50% higher than the national average contribute to their overall cost of living. So that's why we kind of took the route of talking about cost of living during our case, because it's like a domino effect. If you are not able to pay for your housing, again, groceries versus rent. You can't pay for your housing, you can't pay for your groceries, you can't pay for basic necessities. You have to allocate your money and you have to streamline what you have and kind of make those tough decisions on prioritizing things that you shouldn't have to decide between, and you should have access to both. So that is why that we kind of took that route during our case.
Oh, thank you all for your answers and responding. So we're going to move on. So now we'll give an opportunity to Professor Pedraza and Cesar Gomez to give a few comments as well as declare the winner of today's debate. Professor Pedraza, you may begin.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, okay, great. I'll just start out by saying thank you again for inviting me to be a guest judge. It was a real privilege and a treat to hear the teams bring out some really timely thoughts and considerations about a topic that is clearly of interest to the broader Inland Empire, but one that's also tackling and faced by communities outside the Inland Empire. So it really is a testament to whoever selected the topic to grapple with something that is not only vexing us here locally, but is also something that is of interest to the statewide, even national, even global communities. So I appreciate that. One of the things that I wanted to point out was that I was extremely impressed with the degree of sophistication that both teams displayed. So it was clear from my perspective as an educator that we're doing something right here at the School of Public Policy. And I really, really like that you, Team 1 and Team 2, didn't shy from using very sophisticated policy language as well as analytical terms that a general audience may not be quite familiar with, but you, in many cases, deployed it in a way that was accessible. And so I thought that was a mark of excellence and a high standard that each of you should pat yourselves on the back with. Before I give some more thoughts on sort of who we thought were the victors, I wanted to let Mr. Gomez get a chance, give a chance to chime in here and say any other thoughts, and I think we'll sort of pivot to talking about who we saw or thought was sort of the more compelling team in this debate.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you guys hear me okay? So I just want to thank the Dean's brand ambassadors for the invitation. It was a pleasure to be part of this and hear both sides of the argument. I want to applaud all the participants for shining this issue, and bringing it forward, just because I know it's important. And when I was a student at UCR, I graduated about almost 5 years ago. And my time at UCR, it felt like there was always a bubble living at UCR and being part of the UCR community, where you only knew about the issues affecting that community. And I feel like a lot of students go there and then they leave out and never have an understanding of what's going on in the surrounding areas. So just to see how all of you are aware of what's going on in the IE, whether you're from the IE or not, is outstanding. And it's something I applaud all of you for knowing the issues that are going beyond the university community. And yeah, I look forward to continuing with Dr. Pedraza here for the next part of the debate.
Thank you for both of your comments. If one of you would like to declare the winner, please do so now.
Please, Mr. Gomez, go ahead.
Oh, you go ahead, Dr. Pedraza.
Okay, so well, we'll in the private side chat, we went back and forth and thought that one of the things that we found very compelling and set Team 2 apart as sort of the victor today was that they made a very clear connection between cost of living and a much broader perspective that took into consideration some of the, in their own language, the fundamentals of the economy. But even without going into some of the substantive arguments, what I think allowed them to make a more convincing case was that they sort of kept a very clear line of sight between the argument that there's a very clear, or there's a basic understanding of the way that the economy works, as well as the sort of challenge that local policymakers will be facing in order to strike a balance, right, between the need for additional revenue and the need for meeting these challenges of growth in the Inland Empire. We collected a couple of thoughts about what we thought would be some suggestions for Team 1 if they were going to advance the same line of argument. One of the things that we thought would be useful is if we had a clearer understanding of the way that the focus on housing was particularly crucial. And towards the end, I think you did sort of start to connect some of those threads a little bit more tightly. But in the initial presentation of your argument, we were left sort of wondering, how is this going to address some of the other broader components of the way that cost of living is connected to some other things out there. Another thing that we wanted to suggest is that perhaps we might give a little bit more of justification for the reason why students are a crucial slice of the population that need to be protected, and specifically how cities would decide in partnering with universities, how they're going to reduce costs of living and for how long. So it was reasonable to assert, we think, that cities have to make a role, but that sort of begs the question of how in the decision-making process will that happen? And had that been added to the argument, the nitty-gritty of the process of decision-making by local officials, for example, that might have provided a little bit more of a compelling argument to say, okay, now we're on board in terms of like, this is how it's done, and specifically the actors that will be making the decisions and the way that they will go about doing that. Is there anything else that you wanted to add, Mr. Gomez?
Yeah, so basically everything that I want to echo everything that Dr. Pedraza mentioned, but also, you know, I think one thing I want to mention is the importance of having students or a university in that city and the impact that it makes for that city, whether it's in revenue, whether it's in having or developing the next workforce, whatever it may be. I think the city also needs to focus on that And do want to mention that, you know, both sides, both teams presented very good arguments. But, you know, with Team 2, there was a more broader understanding of kind of the economics and everything that goes beyond student housing.
Let me add one other thing. And so to put it a little bit more differently, one of the things that Team 2, I think, did well was that they used a couple of key statements and phrases as their touchstones. So throughout the different parts of the debates, they just kept coming back to those specific touchstones. And I think that's an effective way to remind the audience that no matter what additional counter arguments or considerations are raised in the cross-examination, I'm going to go down in flames with this specific sort of set of phrases and arguments, and I will not deviate. And the moment you start to add more and or sort of hedge or provide qualifiers, I think that's when it starts to feel like, there's some holes there. in the argument, which is to say that I think you could make an effective case along the lines that Team 1 did by identifying similar or analog touchstone phrases that you come back to and you just never deviate from them. You just keep sticking with them throughout the entire debate and go down in flame with those. Last thoughts, Mr. Gomez?
Yeah, this is just, this is not to say that the arguments brought forward by Team 1 are not important or anything like that. It's more so on the presentation or what was put forward on this debate.
Right, so congratulations to Team 2, Sam and Andrea. That is unfortunately all the time we have for today's debate. A special thank you to everyone involved, Sam, Andrea, Nava, and Imad for showcasing their excellent debate skills. Truly a round of applause for everyone. And a special thank you as well to Cesar Gomez and Professor Pedraza for taking time out of their busy schedules to be here today. We truly appreciate it. And lastly, thank you everyone for joining us today for the special debate hosted by the UCR School of Public Policy. We look forward to seeing you at the next SPP event, which will be a seminar with Council Member Ronaldo Fierro on June 3rd. You can find out more at spp.ucr.edu. We'll see you all next time.